Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for allowing me to weigh in on this, on this very important motion that's brought forward by a member from Regina Rosemont. But I do need to get a few things, I think, on record right away here. And I just finding it really special hearing comments from our new member from Saskatoon-Meewasin regarding some of the comments regarding liquor board stores. So, that is a special presentation that he's made, and obviously we have a number of issues based around that. But I think the one thing, it's funny where we hear from our opposition here talking about their stance on the carbon tax. Yet I just Googled their website, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and on it it's a comment from their previous leader, and here's his comments regarding a carbon tax. Saskatchewan people need a plan. They need a plan to distribute carbon pricing revenue model using a means-tested rebate. The fairest way to reallocate these funds, Mr. Deputy Speaker. They're talking about a carbon tax. They're not refuting a carbon tax. They're still accepting the premise that a carbon tax is essential, Mr. Speaker. It needs to recognize, incorporate into rebate structures the distinct needs of rural communities and agriculture producers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, that's not what they present here in this Assembly, but that is what they present to the public out there, Mr. Speaker, and that's where credibility issues come from, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when we see, or lack thereof, from what we see in the two different sides of the carbon tax debate, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The other thing I'd like to get on record, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is unfortunately our member from Regina Rosemont indicated that we have not done anything to support our ag and livestock sector, especially during the last couple of years of drought. Just want to get into the record, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a number of things, a number of key priorities that we've had to support our livestock sector and our crop sector. Doubled the low yield appraisal threshold values, Mr. Speaker. We increased the farm and ranch infrastructure program significant values to allow our producers to drill wells to provide water for their livestock producers. Created the livestock price insurance program and significantly enhanced all parts of that, whether it's a forage rainfall insurance, forage yield insurance, wildlife damage compensation. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Drought Response Initiative, over $119 million direct support to the livestock producers. Over $2.3 billion in crop insurance claims were paid out to producers, the highest payout in history. Let me repeat that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, $2.3 billion in crop insurance claims. Highest per acre coverage in crop insurance history, highest crop insurance budget in history, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Those are all things that we have done to support our ag sector, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in times of need. Now, let's get back on track. Mr. Deputy Speaker, our Minister of Ag has been having very extensive discussions, both formal and informal, with industry stakeholders from across the food spectrum, including a number of producer groups. Collectively, they agree that if there's to be a specific entity that should be undertaking a grocery pricing probe, it should probably be the Competition Bureau of Canada. My suspicions would be they'd quickly find out that ultimately carbon pricing is going to be a significant effect in some of the increased prices that we see. The other blatant fact is that producers and value-added industries are at the mercy of world dynamics. I believe our member from Mooseman talked about that. Interest rates, supply chain logistics, freight, fuel costs are all part of the expense side of the ledger, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we see increasing costs. I thought the Toronto Star, October 7th editorial piece by Diane Breesbaugh got to the point very succinctly. In it, she indicates that food inflation needs to be understood, both figuratively and literally, from the ground up. The reason that prices have risen sharply on grocery shelves is really straightforward. Vendors, the manufacturers, processors, wholesalers of food have been raising prices repeatedly and almost across the board. And that is overwhelmingly the biggest driver of higher food costs. That's a given. That's granted. But that's not to castigate the vendors, but a simple statement of fact. Vendors' own costs are soaring, primarily because the prices of suppliers, growers, and importers have been increasing at unprecedented rates. And farmers have been hit hard, facing massive cost increases from fertilizer, fuel, and feed. We're experiencing a very unique confluence of events: war, extreme weather, soaring fuel costs, piling atop of supply chain disruptions, and certainly labour shortages that arose during the pandemic. The NDP might like to pretend otherwise, but the single biggest villain is Putin's invasion that struck at grain and fertilizer exports of two of the world's biggest producers, Ukraine and Russia, driving up global prices for these commodities. Grain is critical, not only for bread, staples like pasta, cereals and cooking oils, but as the base for the majority of products in the core aisles of all our grocery stores. Grain also feeds most animals raised for meat, eggs and dairy. Dairy, the supply management industry, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the wholesale price is set here in Canada. It's risen by over 10.9% in 2022. Again, the government-established Canadian Dairy Commission has responded to rising costs at the farm level for feed, fuel and fertilizer, which are then passed on to processors and ultimately to the grocers. But there's still uncertainty, really, as to where prices, when they're going to stabilize. Of course, some big geopolitical and climatic risks that we still have in front of us. What's critical for both industry and government is to look at the whole picture, not just the surface, and to factor that into any policy approaches for commentary. So let's bring this down to the micro level, and let's discuss the role of the federally imposed carbon tax that it plays in increasing costs at the producer level. Every farmer and rancher pays an escalating carbon tax on every piece of product that not only comes onto the farm, but what also leaves the farm. Inputs that are used for production of every food item, whether food, fuel or fertilizer, has a federally imposed carbon tax on it. Every piece of equipment that's manufactured, either in this province or in this country, that helps to generate that commodity is subject to a carbon tax. Then, once that product is harvested, it needs processing, drying, or maybe further improvement before shipping. Now, apparently the drying part may not be or may be subject to a carbon tax. We're still not sure yet. But then that product is loaded onto a truck and move that to a processor. Well, hopefully that processor's in Saskatchewan, or soon will be. But again, shipping, subject to a carbon tax. Whether on a plane, train, or automobile, it's subject to a carbon tax. Then it goes to a mill, or a malt plant, or a crush plant, or a fractionator plant. Every switch turned on or a gas valve activated has product flowing through it, subject to a carbon tax. Then finally we get that product, maybe into a loaf of bread, jug of canola oil, can of beer, maybe salad. Every component going into that process has attracted a carbon tax on a portion of that process. Really, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm sorry, but that pittance that the federal government sends me every quarter is nowhere close to the exposure that we've been exposed to in the carbon tax in every single process, getting that item onto my plate every mealtime. Now, I'd like to question the opposition on how you'd like us to proceed with minimizing, or worse yet, maybe nationalizing the profits that our valuable value-added processors exist in this province may be subject to. I believe there's a lot of historical examples of probably some ill-conceived ideas to control inflation that both this province and federal government has undertaken in the past that really have not gone too well for us as consumers. So it's interesting, as this party, this government has been engaging with real Saskatchewan producers, real livestock owners, real manufacturers. The more we talk to producers and manufacturers, the more we've been finding the true threat is a federally imposed carbon tax to our economy. We've seen energy bills for our hog and chicken producers that have anywhere from 30 to 40% of the energy costs made up of carbon tax. Our equipment manufacturers are seeing carbon tax. Over 30% of their energy costs are made up of carbon tax. The worst part is that carbon tax is subject to GST, a tax on a tax, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And we haven't even projected what the cost of the newly minted Clean Fuel Standard, Methane Reduction Standards, Bill C-69, and all the other ill-conceived policies that the federal government's going to be inflicting on us. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I really find it ironic that probably, or maybe it's more Wonderland thinking, that the opposition has supported a carbon tax that is ultimately meant to increase the cost of fuel to reduce consumption. Now that policy is actually effective, increasing the cost of fuel. Now they want to reduce the price of fuel, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So there's honestly a lot of cruel irony in that process, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So how about we eliminate the carbon tax? Let's support innovation. Let's support all of the great things that are going on in this province in our innovation sector, whether it's the University of Saskatchewan, in the private sector. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have got so much great things going on here that I cannot support the motion put forward.